Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about an artist whose finished paintings were never truly finished. There is something about a painting that feels like memory, the way it holds a moment still, the way it insists, this is how it was. The light was like this. The figure stood here. The road was empty, and the sky was the color of late afternoon, and nothing had changed, and nothing would. Mathieu had always believed that. He had believed it the way painters believe in things, quietly, without examination, the way you believe in the weight of a brush or the particular smell of linseed oil drying on a warm afternoon. Some things simply are, and a finished painting is finished. That is the nature of the thing. He was not sure now, when he had stopped believing it. The studio was on the third floor of a converted warehouse on the edge of the Plateau Montreal, in a neighborhood that smelled of old brick and coffee, and the particular cold that comes off the river in early spring. Mathieu had found it 7 years ago, had signed a lease the same afternoon he first walked in, because the light was extraordinary, long and golden in the morning, diffuse and gray by afternoon, and because the floorboards were paint-stained, in a way that told him someone had worked here seriously, had stood in this exact room, and made things, and that felt like permission. He worked large, always had. His canvases were the kind that needed 2 people to carry. Figurative works, mostly, painted in the tradition of the old Northern Europeans, but with something looser in the brushwork, something that let the figures breathe. A woman standing at a market stall, a man reading beneath a street lamp, a family seated at a table, the meal not yet begun, the light between them, the particular warm gold of an hour before evening. He painted from life when he could, from photographs when he couldn't, and sometimes, more often than he would admit, from something that arrived in the space between sleep and waking, a composition that appeared fully formed before he had even opened his eyes, as if it had been waiting for him on the other side of sleep. Those were the paintings he trusted least and loved most. The studio smelled of linseed and turpentine and the faint mineral sharpness of dry pigment. Canvases leaned against every wall, finished and unfinished together, though Mathieu always knew which was which. A finished painting had a quality he could not precisely name, a settled quality, a sense of having arrived somewhere and stopped moving. He had stopped looking at the painting on the east wall. It had started, as these things tend to, with something small. The first painting to change was one he had sold 3 years ago, a large interior scene. A woman in a red coat standing at the window of a room Mathieu had invented entirely. He had finished it on a Thursday, signed it in the lower right corner, and handed it over to the gallery the following Monday. He had photographed it before it left, as he always did. He kept those photographs in a folder on his laptop, a kind of archive of where things had gone. He had opened the folder for other reasons, looking for something else. The particular shade of red in a reference image he was sure he had saved near the same time. And he had seen the photograph of the woman in the red coat, and he had looked at it for a long time. In the painting, as he remembered it, the woman had been facing the window, her back to the viewer, her face unknown. In the photograph, his photograph, taken with his own phone, on the day before the painting left the studio, she was turned slightly to one side. Not fully, not dramatically, just enough. Just a quarter turn, the kind of movement that suggests someone who has heard something, a sound at the edge of hearing, a name spoken too quietly to be certain. Her face was still not visible, but the angle of her head was different. The set of her shoulders was different. She was, unmistakably, in the process of turning. Mathieu had stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he had closed the laptop, gone to the kitchen, made tea he did not drink, and told himself he had simply misremembered. That was the thing about paintings you no longer lived with. They softened in memory. Details shifted. The mind smoothed and simplified, and occasionally invented. He had misremembered. That was all. He almost believed it. The second painting was still in the studio. He had not sold it. He had never quite been able to, though he couldn't have said why. It was a figure study. A man in a gray coat standing at a tall window, looking out into a street Mathieu had painted from imagination. The painting was large, perhaps the largest he had made that year, and there was something in the man's posture that he had always liked, a quality of patient attention, of someone who had been watching for a long time and had made peace with the waiting. The man was inside the building. That had been the point of the painting. The window as threshold, the man as observer, the street visible through the glass as a world just out of reach. Mathieu noticed it on a Tuesday morning, arriving at the studio before 7 to catch the early light. He had not been looking at the painting specifically. He had been moving through the room, setting up, pulling a canvas forward from the stack against the south wall, when he glanced toward the east wall and stopped. The man was outside the window. He was standing in the street, the same gray coat, the same patient posture, but now he was outside the building, on the pavement, looking up. The window he had been standing at was still visible in the painting, empty now, and the man was in the street below it. His face tilted slightly upward, as though he had stepped out of the building and was now looking back at the room he had left. Mathieu set down what he was carrying. He stood in front of the painting for a very long time. The studio was quiet, the kind of morning quiet that has texture, that is made of small sounds. A pipe somewhere in the building, traffic a long way off. The particular silence that lives inside paint-stained rooms. He stood, and he looked, and the man in the gray coat looked back at him from the street in the painting, patient and still. He took a photograph. He compared it to the photograph in his archive. He sat on the floor in front of the painting and put his hands on his knees and breathed slowly. The paintings were not the same. He told himself there were explanations. There are always explanations, if you look for them with enough conviction. He had misremembered. The photographs had been taken at different angles, different lighting conditions. He had been tired when he painted. He had been tired when he photographed. Memory is not reliable. Perception is not reliable. Artists especially, artists who stare at surfaces all day, who train themselves to see, are susceptible to a kind of visual drift, a tendency to see what they expect to see until suddenly they see something else entirely. He worked through these explanations carefully, the way you work through a proof, methodically, without rushing, testing each possibility before moving to the next. By the end of the afternoon, he had found no explanation that held. He went home. He slept badly. He came back the next morning and looked at the man in the gray coat, who was still standing in the street, still looking up at the empty window. And Mathieu thought, "You were inside. I put you inside." The man did not answer. Of course he didn't. He was paint on canvas. He was cadmium gray and raw umber and a little titanium white, applied with a number 6 filbert brush on a Thursday in November 3 years ago. And he was not moving. And he was not outside. And nothing had changed, except that something had. The third painting was the one that made him sit down. It was a landscape. The only pure landscape he had made in years. Painted 2 summers ago, during a week he had spent alone in the eastern townships. A rental house on the edge of a small lake. The kind of week that is supposed to clear the mind, but mostly just makes the mind run quieter, which is not the same thing. He had painted the road that ran past the house. A gravel road, mostly straight, bordered on either side by pale grass and the occasional stands of birch. The sky above it was the particular flat white of an overcast summer afternoon. The road stretched away from the viewer and disappeared at the horizon, long and empty and still. That was the painting, an empty road, nothing on it, nothing at all. He had brought it back to the studio and leaned it against the east wall and looked at it for a few days, and then, deciding it was finished, it felt finished. It had that settled quality. Had moved it to the stack of completed works against the far wall, where it had remained since. He had pulled it out now, propped it against the east wall in the morning light, and stood in front of it. There was a figure on the road. Small, very small, at the far end of the road near the horizon. The kind of small that suggests great distance. A figure upright, facing the viewer. No detail at that size, just the suggestion of a person. A darkness against the flat, white sky. The road stretching between them and the viewer, like a long, straight sentence. Mathieu looked at the figure for a long time. He found his archived photograph. He opened it on his phone and held it up beside the painting. In the photograph, an empty road. In the painting, a figure at the horizon. He sat down on the floor. The studio was warm. The sun had moved around to the west-facing skylights by now, and the light was coming in at a low angle, filling the room with a golden warmth that on any other day he would have stopped to appreciate. He sat on the paint-stained floorboards and looked at the figure on the road. And the figure looked back at him from a very great distance, and neither of them moved. He began to look at all of them. He pulled the finished canvases out one by one, propped them against the wall in the afternoon light, and compared them to his photographs. Not all of them had changed. The market woman was still facing the stall. The man beneath the street lamp was still reading. The family at the table was still waiting for their meal, the light still warm between them. But others, a painting of a garden, late summer, the kind of garden that has been left to itself. In the photograph, the gate at the far end was closed. In the painting, it stood open just slightly, the way a gate stands open. when someone has passed through it recently and not thought to pull it shut behind them. A painting of a stairwell, a long downward perspective, the steps disappearing into shadow below. In the photograph, the stairwell was empty. In the painting now, there was a hand on the railing. Just a hand. At the bottom of the frame, where the stairwell curved away. A hand holding the railing, the wrist disappearing below the edge of the canvas. He set that one down carefully, face to the wall. He went to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the street below. Real street, real afternoon, real people moving through ordinary light, and breathed. When he went back to the studio, he looked at the road painting again. The figure was closer. He was certain of it. He could not prove it, could not measure the change, could not hold a ruler to the canvas and demonstrate the distance. But the figure was closer. It had been near the horizon. Now it was perhaps a third of the way down the road. Still small, still indistinct, still facing him, still walking toward him, in whatever time paintings use when no one is watching. He thought about destroying it. He stood in front of the landscape with a palette knife in his hand, a wide, flexible blade he used for mixing, for scraping, for the kind of rough correction that needed force rather than precision. And he looked at the figure on the road, and he thought about dragging the knife across the canvas, about removing whatever was there, about making it empty again the way it had been when he finished it, when he signed it, when he decided it was done. He did not do it. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct that felt older than reason. The same instinct, perhaps, that makes you careful around things you don't understand, that makes you leave the gate closed, that makes you keep your distance from the edge. He set the palette knife down on the work table. He covered the painting with a cloth. He went home. He came back the next morning, as he always did. The studio was the same. The light, the smell, the weight of the room, the particular quality of silence that belonged to it. He moved through his morning routine. Coffee from the thermos he brought from home. The slow process of choosing which canvas to work on. The gentle re-entry into the world of making that felt, always, like coming back from somewhere very far away. He did not look at the covered painting. He worked for 3 hours on a new canvas. A figure in a kitchen, morning light. The ordinary sacred quality of someone standing at a counter before the day has asked anything of them. He lost himself in it the way he always did. The way that was the reason for all of it. That absorption, that temporary erasure of the self into something being made. When he surfaced, the light had changed. Late morning now. He put down the brush and stretched and looked around the room. The cloth was on the floor, not pulled off, not disturbed in any obvious way. Just on the floor, as though it had settled there slowly, as though the painting had simply let it fall. He looked at the road painting. The figure was halfway down the road now, close enough that he could see, not detail, not a face, not any feature he could name, but the shape of a person, the particular way a person takes up space in the world. The coat, perhaps. The posture. Something familiar in the way the figure stood, even while walking. That quality of patient certainty, of someone who has been coming for a long time and knows they will arrive. He looked at the figure, and he had the feeling, quiet, settling, the way the other understandings had come to him on this train of strangeness, that the figure was familiar, that he knew this figure, that somewhere in the place where paintings come from, in that space between sleep and waking, where compositions arrive fully formed. He had met this person before. He had painted this person before. He just did not know which painting. That evening, he sat in the studio after the light had gone, the room lit only by the work lights he used for late sessions. He sat on a stool in the center of the room and looked at all his finished paintings, the ones he had propped against the walls, and he thought about the nature of a finished thing. A painting is not a photograph. He had always known that. A photograph captures a moment. A painting is a decision. Every brushstroke a choice. The whole thing a kind of argument about what was true, what was important, what deserved to be preserved. And an argument, he supposed, can continue after you've walked away from it, can go on making its case in the dark. He looked at the road painting. The figure had not moved while he watched. Of course it hadn't. He was watching. He thought about that. He thought about all the hours the paintings had spent alone, stacked against walls, facing corners, turned away from the light. All the hours he had not been watching, and whether, in those unwatched hours, something in them had continued. Whether the figures he had made had kept moving through the worlds he had given them, had simply been polite enough to stop when he returned, had learned, perhaps, to hold their positions until the door opened, and the light came on, and someone was there again, to see them. He was not sure if this was a comforting thought or not. He covered the road painting again before he left, carefully this time, tucking the cloth beneath the bottom edge of the canvas, weighing the corners. In the morning, the cloth was on the floor. He did not pick it up. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the figure on the road. Closer still. He could not say how much closer. Close enough that when the morning light moved across the canvas at its particular low angle, it seemed for just a moment, as though the figure's posture had shifted slightly, the way someone shifts when they are deciding whether to raise a hand, whether to wave, or call out, or simply wait. Mathieu looked at the figure. He picked up a brush. He stood at his new canvas and began to work. And after a while, the light changed, and the smell of linseed oil rose, and the room settled into its familiar rhythm. And he did not look at the road painting for the rest of the morning. But he knew. He understood with that same quiet certainty that the figure was still coming, that it had been coming for some time, that one day perhaps it would reach the edge of the canvas. And then what? He painted. The tracks clicked. The light moved. The studio held its breath. And somewhere in a landscape on the east wall of a studio in Montreal, a figure walked a road that had no end, toward a viewer who had stopped looking away. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even a finished painting can hold something that isn't finished. If this stillness stayed with you, if the smell of linseed oil and the quiet of an empty studio settled somewhere behind your eyes, then let it remain a little while longer. Some things we make keep moving after we look away. Rest now The canvas will hold what it holds.